A flight attendant shoved a black teen into the overhead bin and slammed it shut as passengers screamed. Seconds later, the CEO snapped the attendant's neck against the same bin. What happens next will leave you speechless. He shoved a baby into the overhead bin and slammed it shut, certain no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The overhead bin slammed shut with a sharp metallic clunk that sliced through the quiet hum of the cabin. Darius Kellington blinked, startled by the sudden noise above him. He looked up calmly, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly as the latch clicked into place. The flight attendant responsible, a tall man with a pressed uniform and rigid posture, turned without a word. His name tag read Conrad Vale, but it was the brief flash of contempt in his eyes, not his name, that lingered in Darius's mind. Malik stirred in his arms, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. The infant's tiny fists curled near his father's chest, his head nestled against the fabric of Darius's navy blazer. Darius gently rocked him, his motions slow and practiced, as if every sway contained years of instinct. He kept his gaze steady on Conrad's retreating figure, watching how the man stiffly moved down the aisle, his expression set in a quiet grimace as he passed the next row of passengers. Darius didn't speak. He had no reason to, yet something about the interaction left a residue of unease in the air. He glanced around the dimly lit cabin. Most of the passengers were already settling in for the night, some slipping on headphones, others adjusting the recline on their seats. A few exchanged pleasantries, but most remained cloaked in the stillness that red-eye flights usually demanded. Oralis Systems had sent him across the country before, but this trip mattered more than any that came before it. In just under 12 hours, he would stand before investors and partners at a technology summit that could shift his company into a global player. The proposal he carried in his tablet held not only revolutionary code but years of ambition and sacrifice. It was a legacy waiting to be written. And yet, in this moment, all that mattered to him was Malik, safe, sleeping, and untouched by the chaos the world often delivered without warning. He adjusted the baby's blanket, a soft cotton piece patterned with yellow stars, then turned his attention back to the overhead bin. Why did that sound bother him so much? It had been just a compartment door, nothing more. But the way Conrad had slammed it, without a glance, without an apology, left a strange sense of performance. Like he had done it for someone, or against someone. A faint whisper of tension crept into Darius's chest. He dismissed it with a slow breath. "You doing all right, sir?" asked a male attendant walking past. His voice was polite but distracted, his eyes already scanning elsewhere. "Fine," Darius replied. He offered a faint smile to avoid appearing difficult, though his mind was still retracing the look on Conrad's face. The lights overhead dimmed further, casting long shadows across the aisle. The engine's rumble deepened as the plane leveled out. Darius leaned back in his seat, resting his head lightly against the cushion. Across the aisle, a man in a gray jacket opened a paperback novel. Another passenger nearby wrapped himself tightly in a blanket. The usual choreography of a night flight unfolded with quiet rhythm. Conrad returned. This time, he stopped 2 rows back, speaking to a passenger about tray tables and seatbelts. His tone was clipped, efficient, and cold. His eyes flicked past the man he was speaking to and landed on Darius again, just briefly but long enough for the air to grow thinner between them. Darius looked away, pretending not to notice, but he couldn't shake the sensation that he had just been measured and found offensive. Not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. A black man, a father, a professional dressed in success, cradling the most vulnerable piece of his life. Malik whimpered. Darius instinctively bounced his knee, rocking the baby gently. The child settled with a sleepy sigh. A few seconds later, Conrad moved past their row again. His hand grazed the edge of the seat, and as he passed, Darius heard a murmur, soft but deliberate. "Should have stayed in business class." The words were gone before Darius could fully process them. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear, just enough for him. Darius turned his head slowly. His eyes met Conrad's back as the attendant continued walking, now disappearing behind the curtain that led to the galley. Darius's lips pressed into a firm line. He wasn't new to moments like this. He had endured them in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, and social events masked in civility. Always the same condescension wrapped in protocol. But this was different. This was directed at his son. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat quietly, his hand brushing Malik's forehead, soothing the baby's skin while his mind sharpened. It wasn't time to act. Not yet, but the foundation was shifting, and he knew it. He had learned long ago to read the wind before the storm. The baby stirred again. Darius leaned close, whispering gently into Malik's ear. "We're all right?" Just a little longer. Outside the window, the darkness stretched endlessly. No city lights, no clouds, just sky and silence. And yet inside, the cabin breathed differently now. Something unseen but undeniable had taken root, a tension that no seatbelt could restrain. Far ahead, a metallic rattle echoed faintly from another bin being opened, a snap of a latch, a brief creak of metal. Normal noises to anyone else, but to Darius, they struck a strange chord, like distant thunder too early in the night. He looked again toward the galley. Conrad hadn't returned. The baby shifted slightly in his arms. Darius held him tighter, his grip protective. He whispered again, almost to himself this time. "Just keep your head down. One flight, that's all." But even as he said it, he knew. This was no ordinary flight. The moment had already begun to turn, and the sound of that bin slamming shut was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The journey that began as routine was already writing its own rebellion. As the plane leveled out into cruising altitude, the soft cabin lighting cast a faint golden hue across the rows of resting passengers. The rhythmic hum of the engines wrapped the space in a strange calm, broken only by the muffled rustle of shifting feet and the occasional click of a seatbelt. Darius Kellington, seated near the front, gently cradled his infant son, Malik, against his chest. The child had begun to cry, not loudly but enough to pierce the silence. Darius adjusted his grip, rocking Malik slowly. He offered a warm bottle, his other hand stroking the baby's back in steady, practiced circles. He hummed a low tune, one he often sang at home during restless nights, hoping the familiar sound might soothe his child now. A few passengers glanced over their shoulders with mild concern, their expressions curious rather than annoyed. None complained. Yet from the far end of the aisle a figure began to move with deliberate pace. The sharp click of polished shoes against the narrow floor echoed with growing intensity. Conrad Vale approached like a storm barely held together by protocol, his posture stiff, chin lifted in brittle authority. His uniform was immaculate, pressed and spotless, but there was something cold beneath the surface, something that Darius had sensed the moment they boarded. "Sir," Conrad began, his voice clipped and formal, "you need to quiet the child. You're disturbing the rest of the cabin." Darius met his gaze evenly, not aggressive, but not submissive either. He adjusted Malik in his arms and kept his voice steady. "He's an infant. He'll settle down in a moment. I've got it under control." Conrad's eyes narrowed slightly, the edges of his mouth twitching as if suppressing a sneer. He leaned in just a little closer, his hands clasped behind his back in a mockery of calm. "We've had complaints." "No one has said anything," Darius replied quietly, "and I've been doing everything I can." "He's not hurting anyone?" Conrad didn't respond right away. Instead, he scanned the nearby rows where passengers now looked away uncomfortably, pretending not to listen. His shoulders tightened. "Some people," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Darius to hear, "always think the rules don't apply to them." Darius froze. The words were casual in tone, but they landed like a slap. For a moment, he simply stared at Conrad, absorbing the insult. The meaning wasn't subtle. It never was when it came from men like him. The emphasis on "some people" wasn't about parenting. It was about something deeper, older, and uglier. "I beg your pardon," Darius said, still quiet but no longer calm. But Conrad was already pulling back, his hands adjusting a cufflink as though he hadn't spoken. He gave a tight nod and turned away, walking back down the aisle with the kind of arrogance only authority could protect. Darius watched him go, a hard knot forming in his chest. Malik whimpered again, and he returned his attention to his son, gently wiping away a tear that traced down the boy's round cheek. The unease didn't fade. In fact, it worsened. He noticed something subtle in Conrad's behavior each time the attendant passed by again, his eyes flicked toward the overhead bins. It wasn't the kind of glance one gives to check for safety compliance. It was calculating, measured. Twice more, Conrad slowed near Darius's row, eyeing the storage compartment above their heads. Darius followed the gaze, frowning slightly. The bins, ordinary and gray, suddenly felt different under scrutiny. Metal, hinged, lockable. He shook the thought from his head. Surely not, but the mind, once alarmed, rarely settles. Darius adjusted Malik's blanket, his own heartbeat louder now than his son's soft cries. Across the aisle, one man glanced at him with quiet sympathy, but said nothing. That was how these things happened, slowly, quietly, with everyone pretending not to see until it was too late. He took a slow breath, remembering who he was. A CEO, a father, a man who had overcome far greater challenges than this. Yet the danger here was different. It wore a uniform, smiled with teeth, and moved under the cover of civility. Malik stirred again, his face scrunching as he let out a brief wail. Darius reached for the pacifier, only for his hand to brush against the cool plastic of the seat tray. The snap of a storage bin closing 3 rows behind startled him. He turned. Nothing unusual, just another attendant organizing supplies. Still, the sound was sharp. Too sharp. Conrad reappeared minutes later. This time, he said nothing. He simply paused near Darius's seat, glancing again at the bin. His hand hovered near the latch just briefly before walking on. Darius gripped Malik a little tighter. He knew then, without question, that something was wrong. This wasn't about noise complaints. It wasn't about rules. It was about something personal. The way Conrad looked at him, it wasn't just annoyance. It was hatred buried beneath professionalism. The kind that waits for the right moment to spill out. The kind that calculates. He stared at the bin above them, then down at his child, then to the aisle where Conrad had disappeared once more. His instincts, sharpened through years of negotiation, competition, and survival, rang like alarms in his head. He whispered into Malik's ear, his voice barely audible above the drone of the engines. "I've got you. No matter what happens, I've got you." A chill ran through him as the plane continued its quiet journey through the sky. Every shadow in the cabin now seemed sharper. Every click of a latch, every step down the aisle felt like the ticking of a countdown. Sometimes, silence in the cabin hides the loudest threat. Conrad Vale moved like a storm in uniform. He didn't walk. He charged down the narrow aisle, each step louder than the last, his polished shoes slamming against the carpeted floor. The dim lights of the red-eye cabin cast long shadows over his sharp features, and his clenched jaw was rigid with fury. Passengers stirred in their seats, heads lifting cautiously from neck pillows and folded blankets as tension rippled across the cabin like pressure before a thunderclap. Malik cried louder now, his small frame writhing gently in his father's arms as the turbulence intensified. Darius held him close, rocking slowly, whispering lullabies only his child could hear. His hands were steady, though his heart thundered behind his ribs. The baby's cries weren't angry, they were scared. The cabin lights flickered, the engines hummed. Somewhere, a seatbelt sign blinked faintly, ignored. "You need to quiet that baby." Now Conrad's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unforgiving. He stood towering over Darius's row, eyes narrowed, hands resting on his hips as though waiting for a subordinate to obey. Darius looked up slowly, his voice even but edged with warning. "He's just scared. We hit some bumps. He's reacting like any infant would. I've got it under control." "You don't," Conrad shot back, his lips barely moving but his voice thick with contempt. "Passengers are complaining. You're disturbing the entire cabin." A few heads turned. No one spoke. No one had complained, not out loud. Darius knew it, and so did Conrad. The accusation wasn't about noise, it was about control. And who was allowed to have it. "I'm doing my best," Darius replied, shifting Malik to his other arm. "He'll settle." "You've had your chance." Conrad's eyes flared with something deeper than impatience. Without another word, he reached forward. "No, wait," Darius began, rising slightly from his seat. But it was too late. Conrad lunged. His hands gripped Malik's sides with chilling decisiveness, and in one swift, horrifying motion, he yanked the infant from Darius's arms. A sharp intake of breath swept through the rows like wind. Darius froze, not in weakness but in the split-second paralysis of disbelief. His arms remained outstretched, empty, helpless. "Conrad, don't," he managed, but the words felt distant, swallowed by the cabin's low roar. Conrad turned sharply, stepped toward the overhead bin above row 14C, and flung it open. It creaked on its hinges like a warning. Passengers gasped. One woman covered her mouth. Another fumbled for her phone, but fear rooted most into silence. With the force of cruelty disguised as authority, Conrad shoved the baby into the compartment. The lid snapped shut. A wet, unnatural crack echoed through the metal cavity. For a moment, the plane might as well have been floating in a void. The hum of the engines became background to a darker, more piercing silence. It was as if the air itself had recoiled in shock. No one moved, no one screamed. They simply stared. Darius couldn't breathe. The silence in his lungs wasn't shock, it was pain. So deep it stole language. His mind screamed, but his body stood motionless. He stared at the bin as if trying to rewrite reality by sheer will. Then came the sound. Not Malik's cry. Not anymore. Only the echo of the bin's latch. Passengers began to murmur, their voices trembling, urgent. Did he just? He put the baby. Call someone. Is this real? A middle-aged man in a suit stood halfway up, then sat down again. A young guy across the aisle whispered to his seatmate, who shook his head. Frozen. Conrad turned, brushing his hands against his uniform as though wiping away dust. Darius's hands trembled. His breath returned all at once in a jagged rush. His vision sharpened, focusing on the silver latch, the drops of red now trailing from its edge. His muscles tightened. The warmth in his chest twisted into something unrecognizable. But he still hadn't moved. He couldn't, not yet. Everything he believed, everything he loved, everything he protected was in that bin. His world had just been folded into a compartment, sealed shut by hatred. He saw Conrad's smirk. That was when the paralysis broke. But this part of the story wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about the moment right before it. The second when grief became gasoline and rage reached for the match. One row back, a teenage boy slowly lowered the earbuds from his ears, eyes wide. In front of them, an elderly man whispered a prayer, and then Darius took a step forward. The shift was small, but final. His expression no longer pleaded. It calculated. Passengers didn't know it yet, but something had changed. The cabin wasn't just a plane anymore. It had become a cage, one filled with witnesses, silence, and a storm building behind a father's eyes. And from the corner of the cabin, unnoticed by most, the overhead light above row 14C flickered, then went out. The sound of shattering innocence became the drumbeat of rage. The sickening sound of the overhead bin slamming shut echoed like a gunshot across the cabin. Darius froze. For the first time in his life, the world fell completely silent inside him. No sound, no breath, no movement. Just the metallic click of that latch locking shut and the unbearable crack that came a split second before it. The moment didn't stretch, it snapped. Snapped like bone. Snapped like time itself had broken. His son, Malik. A scream tore through the air, but it wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. A man in the third row, or maybe a woman farther back. Darius couldn't tell. All he could hear was the dull roar of blood rushing to his head, his vision narrowing like a tunnel closing in. Conrad Vale stood between him and the bin. The flight attendant's arms were spread wide, as if daring Darius to move. His mouth twisted into a mocking grin, cold and unrepentant. The cruel light in his eyes gleamed brighter than the overhead bulbs. "You should have kept him quiet," he muttered, voice flat, devoid of remorse. Darius didn't reply. His mind was no longer processing words. It was calculating pain, calculating loss, calculating exactly how much strength it would take to make this man vanish from existence. All around them, passengers were no longer asleep. The peaceful hum of the red-eye had shattered. People sat upright, gasping, their eyes darting between the blood-specked bin and the unmoving father standing before it. Some reached for seatbelts, others clutched their armrests, too afraid to speak. One man held his phone up. Whether to call for help or record the moment, no one knew. But Darius didn't see them. His focus tunneled in on Conrad. He took a step forward. "No," Conrad barked, thrusting his hand out. "Back to your seat." Darius took another step. His arms were rigid at his sides, his hands curled slowly into fists. "I said." The sentence never finished. Darius moved. The burst of violence was so sudden, so absolute, that the cabin seemed to fold in on itself. Darius lunged with the full weight of a father's fury, grabbing Conrad by the shirt collar and yanking him forward. Trays clattered to the floor. A water bottle rolled into the aisle. The two men slammed into a row of seats, causing a startled passenger to shriek and scramble away. Conrad grunted, his hands flailing to push Darius back, but the CEO was relentless. Years of boardroom patience gave way to raw, unfiltered rage. Darius didn't speak, didn't shout. He gritted his teeth, muscles clenched, eyes burning with an expression no one had ever seen from him. Not in meetings, not in interviews, not even in moments of private stress. This wasn't stress. This was war. The struggle sprawled into the narrow aisle. Conrad threw a wild elbow that grazed Darius's jaw, but it only sharpened his resolve. The force of grief behind Darius's next movement drove them both toward the overhead bin, the same one that now dripped with something dark and wet. Conrad twisted, trying to break free, but Darius grabbed him by the neck with both hands, slamming him backward. A loud thud rang out as Conrad's head struck the metal panel beside the bin. A passenger cried out. Another scrambled to unbuckle and flee down the aisle. "You hurt my son," Darius finally said, his voice low and shaking. "You put him in there." Conrad tried to sneer, to speak, but the words never came. Darius shoved him up, higher, until Conrad's back was pressed against the edge of the open bin. With a roar that seemed to rise from the bottom of his soul, Darius lifted, twisted, and slammed him in. The fit was violent, unyielding. Bones collided with the frame. The man's limbs flailed for a heartbeat, then the lid came down with force. Snap. A sound like brittle branches breaking underfoot. Gasps filled the cabin. One man staggered into the bulkhead. A young attendant at the front stifled a scream. Darius's hand remained on the latch, his chest heaving. The metal was warm beneath his palm. Behind the sealed door, silence returned, thicker than before. No movement, no sound. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, from the weight of what he'd just done. Blood seeped slowly from the bin's edge, trickling down the plastic in thin, winding lines. It painted the frame like an accusation, like proof. Darius stepped back. No one stopped him. No one dared. He turned slowly to face the cabin. Every eye was on him. He looked down. On the floor beside him lay Malik's tiny sock. It had fallen from the bin during the struggle, red smeared across the white cotton. Darius knelt, picked it up, and held it in his hand like it was the last thread holding his world together. The aisle was quiet now, passengers still as statues. Not a whisper passed between them, and yet in every mind the same sentence burned. What was meant to silence a child had instead awakened a storm no man could contain. The crack of bones still echoed in the air like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. For a moment everything was still, eerily still. Not a breath, not a whisper. Every eye in the cabin had turned toward the overhead bin, its silver handle now tainted with a streak of red. Darius stood in front of it, chest heaving, his arms still raised from the force he had used to slam it shut. Blood, some his own, some not, streaked his shirt and trembled on the tips of his fingers. His eyes, wide and burning, held a mixture of sorrow, rage, and something deeper, something that had broken and refused to mend. Then the silence shattered. Screams pierced the cabin like glass breaking underwater. A woman cried out somewhere near the back. Someone dropped a phone. Another scrambled for theirs. The narrow aisle flooded with confused motion as passengers rose from their seats, some backing away as if from a wild animal, others pressing forward, too stunned to look away. "Step back. Please, remain calm," one of the flight attendants yelled, voice cracking with panic. But the words meant nothing. They fell useless into the chaos, trampled by gasps and murmurs, drowned in the sound of shuffling feet and the soft hum of the engines that still pushed the plane forward through the dark sky. Somewhere above, the fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting the metal bin in a cold glow. It looked ordinary, like every other bin on every other flight, but the silence it held inside was unnatural. Darius didn't move. He stood rooted to the floor, Malik's tiny blanket clutched in his shaking hand. It was torn down the middle, edges frayed and soaked with dark stains. He stared at it like it was the last piece of his world still intact. The soft fabric was crushed tightly in his fist, as if letting go meant letting go of his son completely. His throat clenched, but no sound came. His other hand hovered near his side, fingers twitching as though still echoing the motion of what he had just done. The intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and remain calm. I repeat, please remain seated. We are assessing the situation," the captain's voice said. But the strain in his tone was unmistakable. He was no longer just commanding order, he was begging for it. Several passengers froze, others ignored him, still pressing toward the back. A man in a green sweater tried to film with his phone, but one of the male flight attendants, Julian, his badge read, lunged forward, swatting at the device. "No recording." "Put that away," he barked. Darius turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. The movement made those closest to him recoil as if he might strike again. But he didn't. He simply looked. One by one, his gaze passed over the passengers, some wide-eyed, some tearful, many just stunned. He didn't blame them. He didn't need them to understand. This moment was no longer about how he was seen. It was about what had been done. A boy. His boy. Sealed inside a bin like luggage. The memory would never fade. He had tried to stay calm, tried to follow the rules, tried to be patient. But patience had ended the moment he heard that awful, hollow snap from behind a metal door. Footsteps approached. Marcus, the younger of the two attendants who had stayed back until now, stepped cautiously into the aisle. His voice was low, careful. "Sir, I need you to take a seat. Please. We need to make sure everyone's safe until we land." Darius didn't answer. He blinked slowly, his breath still jagged. Marcus took another step forward, hands half raised like a man approaching a wounded animal. "This doesn't have to get worse." "Worse," Darius whispered, his voice barely carried. But the word froze Marcus in place. Darius turned fully toward him, the blankets still clenched. "Tell me, what's worse than locking a baby in a bin and listening while his bones—" His voice broke, then sharpened. Snap. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. He took a shaky step back. From the opposite aisle, Julian reached for the intercom again, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button. The captain's voice returned, this time softer, but no less urgent. "We understand that something terrible has happened. Please remain calm. We're communicating with ground authorities and—" The rest was drowned out by murmurs rippling through the rows. Words like murder, self-defense, and monster floated in the air, none sticking, all colliding. Darius felt every one of them. But he wasn't listening. His eyes drifted upward toward the bin. Blood still dripped slowly from the seam, falling like thick red tears onto the seat below. And he remembered the sound Malik made when he cried, not just tonight, but every night. The soft whimpers, the hiccuping breaths, the little fists balled in frustration. That sound had filled his home. It had filled his heart. Now, it was gone. "Sir, we need you to put the baby down," Julian started, confused and flustered. "He's already been put down," Darius said flatly. The room stilled again. Every passenger could feel it. The shift. This wasn't over. No one was safe yet. And the plane, impossibly, kept flying. From a few rows behind, someone whispered, "They should have stopped him." That attendant, he was yelling at the kid earlier. Another voice replied, "Did you see what he did?" That father, he just— "I don't blame him," said a third. "I would have done the same." But Darius didn't hear them. Or maybe he did. Maybe he heard every word and let them settle somewhere deep inside where nothing else could reach. He walked 2 steps back and slumped into the aisle seat, finally resting his trembling hands on his knees. The blanket still hung from his fingers. His eyes never left the bin. Julian inched closer but didn't dare touch him. Darius didn't speak again. There were no more words to give. The captain's voice returned once more, now cracking slightly with emotion. We are doing everything we can. Please stay seated. We'll be landing as soon as possible." Darius didn't move, didn't blink. The storm inside him had not passed. It had only shifted shape, and so the aircraft, streaking through the clouds above a sleeping world, continued its descent, not into safety, but into reckoning. The cabin had become a courtroom where fear was the jury, and vengeance the only lawyer. Marcus reached Darius first. Without hesitation, the flight attendant lunged forward and grabbed Darius by the forearm, attempting to wrestle him back into his seat. "Sir, sit down now," Marcus shouted, his voice strained with urgency. Julian was only a second behind, arms wide, trying to assist in pinning the father down. But they had underestimated the storm they were stepping into. Darius's body surged with rage and sorrow, adrenaline sharpening his movements like a blade. Without a word, he twisted his body, breaking Marcus's grip with surprising ease. In one fluid motion, he shoved the man backward, slamming him hard into the armrests of the aisle seats. A sickening thud followed as Marcus crumpled to the floor, groaning and clutching his ribs. The entire cabin gasped in unison. Julian flinched, his eyes wide, caught between training and terror. "Stop! Sir, stop, please," he stammered, raising his hands in a desperate plea, but edging forward all the same. Darius turned, his chest heaving, eyes blazing. His hands were half curled into fists, not out of desire to harm, but as if grasping for something he could never retrieve. "You let him die," he said, voice low and hoarse. "And now you want order?" Julian hesitated. The man before him wasn't out of control. He was focused, locked in grief so pure it looked like fury. Still, protocol dictated action. Julian reached for the small radio clipped to his shoulder and whispered, "Requesting cockpit assistance. We need help." Now around them, passengers leaned away, some shielding their faces, others fumbling for their phones. The aisle had turned into a stage, and every eye watched the unfolding confrontation with silent, breathless dread. From the shadows of the cabin, a man in a charcoal business suit shifted in his seat. Ethan Braddock, quiet, composed, and nearly invisible until now, pulled out his phone and began recording. The glow of the screen lit up his eyes, calm, calculating. He said nothing, made no sound. His lens moved slowly, deliberately, capturing every frame. His face betrayed no emotion, but there was something unsettling in how steady his hands remained. Julian took another cautious step forward, trying to reason through the fear. "You need to calm down, sir. We'll sort this out when we land. Please, just sit." Darius's expression darkened further. "Sort this out," he repeated slowly. "He shoved my son into a bin. Do you really think landing is going to undo that?" Julian opened his mouth but couldn't find words. His training offered scripts for angry customers, for medical emergencies, even for threats of violence, but nothing for a grieving father whose world had been broken in full view of silent witnesses. The hum of the engines beneath them sounded louder now, as if pressing in on the moment. The air felt dense, almost unbreathable, thick with judgment and fear. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, the faint click of a cockpit door opening echoed, but it wasn't yet time for the pilots to act. Ethan's camera lens caught the light at a perfect angle, reflecting like a small eye, cold, unblinking. His fingers shifted slightly, zooming in on Julian's shaking hands, on the sweat trailing down Darius's temple, on the blood-smeared handle of the closed overhead bin. There was no emotion in his gaze, just focus, and perhaps something more. Darius noticed Ethan only then, his eyes locking onto the camera. For a moment, their gaze held. Ethan offered nothing, no smile, no signal, just silence. Darius didn't know who he was, but the look felt like a ledger being opened. He turned back to Julian. "I warned him," Darius said, softer now. "I told him I had it under control." He didn't care. He just saw someone to blame. Julian swallowed hard. "I didn't know. I wasn't there when it happened." "Then why are you here now?" Darius asked. Julian didn't answer. At that moment, Marcus stirred on the floor, groaning as he tried to sit up. Darius took a slow step back, breathing hard, chest rising and falling like waves against steel. No one moved toward him now. Not Julian, not the passengers, not even Ethan. There was a quiet understanding. Something irreversible had taken place. And though the violence had paused, the storm had not passed. Julian lifted his radio again with trembling fingers and whispered, "They need to hurry." Ethan's camera continued to record. Every recording becomes a weapon, though no one knows yet who it will strike. The cockpit door burst open with a sharp click, and Captain Rowan Steele stepped into the cabin, his co-pilot Desmond Crowe close behind. Both men halted mid-step. The sight before them didn't match any emergency manual. Blood smeared the edge of an overhead bin. A body, twisted, limp, and grotesquely bent, hung halfway out, wedged in the very compartment meant to hold luggage. The lifeless figure of flight attendant Conrad Vale was unmistakable, and beneath the dim overhead lights Darius Kellington stood still, cradling a small bloodied blanket in his hands, his son's last trace. Rowan's mouth parted, but no sound came. For a moment, silence pressed against the walls of the cabin, more suffocating than the recycled air. Then he found his voice. "Sir," he said, his tone firm but measured, "I need you to stand down. We'll let the authorities handle this when we land." Darius didn't move. His eyes didn't even flicker toward Rowan. Instead, he tightened his grip on the blanket, his chest heaving slightly. "You think justice waits in line like boarding groups?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "They let cruelty fly in uniforms. Why should justice wait in chains?" The words hung in the air, too sharp, too true, slicing through the illusion of authority like a blade. Rowan stepped forward cautiously, hands raised, but the passengers, all wide-eyed, breath held, seemed frozen between allegiance and fear. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others clutched armrests as if bracing for turbulence that never came. Desmond moved faster, scanning the cabin with the trained eyes of a man used to reading chaos. He spotted Ethan Braddock, the quiet man in the business suit, holding his phone aloft, recording with calm precision. "Sir," Desmond snapped, pointing, "put the phone away." Now Ethan looked up slowly, meeting Desmond's gaze without flinching. "The truth must be documented," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "People need to see what really happened here." He thought cruelty at 30,000 feet would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Rowan made the call. "Prepare the restraints," he ordered in a low voice, turning just slightly toward Desmond and nodding with finality. Darius saw it. He didn't need to hear it. The shift in the air told him everything. The way Desmond subtly adjusted the clip on his belt. How Marcus and Julian started moving with new purpose, their bodies tense and deliberate like men about to close in on something wild. He didn't wait. Darius dropped low in one fluid motion, his knees bending sharply, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. His right arm swept behind him, brushing the edge of the seat for support, while his eyes locked on the approaching forms. His suit jacket flared slightly as he crouched, a flash of crimson smearing the sleeve from earlier. It was not the posture of a man surrendering, it was the poise of a man preparing to strike. Marcus lunged first. "Don't do this!" he shouted, reaching forward, one hand aimed for Darius's wrist, the other braced to clamp his shoulder. Darius met him head-on. With a guttural breath, he twisted his body and drove an elbow straight into Marcus's sternum. The impact was sharp, loud, and final. Marcus reeled backward, his breath knocked clean out of him, collapsing sideways into a row of startled passengers. Their gasps exploded in unison, followed by a woman's muffled cry and the frantic rustle of someone dropping a phone. Julian was next. Younger than Marcus and faster, he sprang forward with a restraint strap coiled in both hands, swinging it toward Darius's arms like a lasso. But Darius spun. His foot hooked behind a meal cart, pulling it sideways as he reached into the galley. His hand closed around a stainless steel serving tray, cool, slick, and unexpectedly heavy. He gripped it by the corner and swung. The tray cracked against Julian's upper arm with a sickening thud, the metal reverberating like a struck bell. Julian let out a strangled yelp and dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder as the restraint strap fell limp to the floor. "Stop him!" Desmond barked from the cockpit doorway, his voice sharp and urgent. But no one moved. The aisle had become a warpath. Blood splattered near the galley entrance, a flight attendant writhing on the floor, another coughing in a passenger's lap. And Darius, centered in it all, was breathing heavily, eyes locked in a storm of pain and fury. To some, he looked like a man unhinged. To others, he looked like a man finally breaking free from the chains of silent suffering. Ethan Braddock hadn't moved from his spot 3 rows back. His phone was still raised, held steady by 2 hands. But now, the red indicator light on the corner of his screen blinked rapidly, confirming what only he knew. He was live. The entire world, or at least everyone on his private stream, was watching it all unfold. The father defending himself, the attendants falling, the blood trailing across the aisle tiles like the aftermath of a battle no one planned for. He edged closer, barely noticed, camera still pointed forward. The lens caught Darius in full frame, sweat on his brow, breath ragged, eyes glowing with something not quite rage but not mercy either. It was raw grief taking form. "Keep your distance," Desmond shouted again, this time aiming at Ethan. "This isn't your business." "It is now," Ethan replied softly, almost under his breath, not lowering the phone for a second. No one stopped him. The passengers were stunned into stillness. Some had begun to record on their own devices. Others peeked cautiously from behind seatbacks, unsure whether to scream, speak, or pray. Darius didn't seem to hear any of it. His focus was a razor's edge. Every movement, every step, every breath felt calculated, controlled, except for the tremble in his left hand, still gripping the blood-stained blanket that once comforted Malik. Julian groaned from the floor, trying to crawl backward toward the jump seat. Marcus sat slumped, coughing, held up by a middle-aged man in a gray hoodie who'd silently offered support. Desmond looked from Rowan to the chaos in the aisle and hesitated. The order had been given, but the plan was failing. Darius had turned the environment to his advantage. Every cart, tray, and corner had become a part of his fortress. "I won't warn you again," Desmond said, stepping forward. Darius turned, slow and deliberate. The tray in his right hand dropped with a dull clang against the floor. "I didn't come here for violence," he said. His voice was hoarse but clear. "But violence came for my son." He took one step forward, and the entire row flinched. From the corner of the cabin, a child whimpered. A man placed a hand protectively over his partner's shoulder. The mood shifted. Fear was still thick, but something else crept in now. Respect, horror, sympathy. The passengers had seen the bin. They had heard the bones. And even if they didn't understand Darius's actions, they could no longer ignore what triggered them. In the background, Ethan's camera continued to stream. No one noticed the small green indicator at the top of his phone blink twice. It wasn't just recording anymore. It was transmitting through a hidden protocol. The footage was being duplicated, auto-sent to cloud storage, mirrored across servers he'd set up weeks ago for another story entirely. The truth was escaping, and Darius, wrapped in grief and fury, had no idea the world was already watching. He only knew one thing. No one else was coming to save his son's memory. He had to do it himself. As the cabin steadied from turbulence, Desmond took one last step forward. Darius raised the blanket in warning, and behind him, Ethan whispered into his mic, 30,000 feet, and justice is climbing." No one spoke. No one moved. What was vengeance in the cabin was becoming judgment in the world outside. The shouts from the galley had barely faded when Rowan took a step forward, hands raised, not in command, but in appeal. The captain's voice was steady, yet softer now, edged with something personal. "Darius," he began, his tone stripped of the authority it once carried, "I know this pain feels bigger than the sky. I lost my brother in a car crash 6 years ago. The man who hit him walked free." Darius stood in the middle of the aisle, his chest rising and falling with heavy, deliberate breaths. Blood stained the front of his shirt, the fabric darkened where Malik's blanket had pressed against it. In his right hand, the metal tray still hung at his side, glinting under the flickering overhead lights. His eyes, sharp and glassy, didn't blink as Rowan spoke. "You think we're all just uniforms and rules," Rowan continued, glancing behind him at Desmond and the bruised flight crew. "But I know what it feels like to want justice and have no one listen. Please, don't make this worse for yourself." Darius laughed, not loud, but bitter and cold. "Worse," he echoed, his voice cracked with emotion. "My son is dead. Murdered in front of me. And now you want me to sit down quietly so your system can decide what happens next?" He stepped back a pace, positioning himself in the middle of the aisle, flanked by seatbacks on both sides. No one could pass without meeting him head-on. His body language was deliberate, strategic. It wasn't just rage, it was preparation. "You want me to pretend this can be fixed with paperwork?" Darius asked, eyes narrowing at Rowan. "You let a man like Conrad wear your badge. You let him walk your aisles." Behind Rowan, Desmond shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Marcus, who leaned against the wall with a bruised lip. Julian sat farther back, clutching his shoulder. The rest of the cabin was deathly silent, passengers frozen in their seats, afraid to breathe too loudly. A few phones were still raised, screens glowing faintly in trembling hands. Then came the unexpected sound of a voice not yet heard in the chaos. "I don't think this was random," said a man in a business suit near the rear. He stepped into the aisle slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to startle a wild animal. It was Ethan Braddock, the unassuming passenger with the ever-present phone. Darius turned to face him, tray still raised. Ethan didn't flinch. He held the phone low now, no longer filming, his voice low and measured. "I'm not just a passenger," he said. "I'm a journalist. Investigative. I boarded this flight because I received 3 anonymous tips over the last 2 months, each pointing to an airline culture that protects violent crew members. Conrad Vale's name showed up all 3 times. Gasps whispered through the rows like a breeze through dry leaves." Rowan's face tightened. Ethan took another step forward. "The airline has been hiding complaints, silencing victims. What happened to Malik? It wasn't the first time something went wrong under their watch. Just the worst, Darius's grip on the tray loosened for the first time. His gaze searched Ethan's face for signs of a lie, but found only truth, raw and disquieting. "You're telling me this was bound to happen?" Darius asked, voice quiet now. That he could have been stopped? Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, and that's why I'm here. I needed to see what they were hiding. Rowan's eyes flicked to Desmond, a silent signal of unease. He took a breath, trying to reclaim control. Mr. Braddock, I must ask you to return to your seat. No, Ethan replied without hesitation. The world needs to know what's happening here. This isn't just about what Darius did. It's about what was allowed to happen long before this flight took off. Darius looked around, the faces of passengers reflecting fear, confusion, and dawning understanding. Some had believed he was dangerous. Now they weren't so sure. He slowly stepped aside, eyes never leaving Ethan. He didn't lower the tray, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, no longer wild, but focused. You have those files with you? He asked. Ethan held up his phone. All of it. Every message. Every name. For a moment, the cabin felt like it wasn't 30,000 feet above the ground, but standing on the edge of something far deeper. Darius exhaled, long and slow. Then maybe this flight wasn't just tragedy, he said. Maybe it's evidence. The engines droned on in the background, but no one noticed. Every eye was on Darius, on Ethan, on Rowan. In that suspended moment, justice no longer felt like a distant thing that lived in courtrooms. It was here, heavy in the air, waiting to be spoken. The flight was still en route. The storm had not yet passed, but something had shifted. The blood on the bin was only the first page of a story no one expected to be written mid-air. The moment Ethan Braddock's calm voice cut through the tension, the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted sharply. I'm not just a passenger, he said, his phone still raised, its screen glowing faintly in the low cabin light. I'm an investigative journalist. And I've been tracking this airline for months. Gasps swept through the rows like a ripple across water. Several passengers leaned forward, others sat frozen, wide-eyed. Darius Kellington's eyes locked onto Ethan's. The CEO's expression, tight with grief, rage, and suspicion, held still for a heartbeat. Then his brow furrowed, calculating. Something in Ethan's tone wasn't self-serving. It carried weight, urgency, truth. Rowan Steele, the captain, stepped forward from the cockpit with stiff posture, trying to reassert control over the unfolding chaos. Mr. Braddock, he barked, his voice commanding but tinged with worry, this is not the time to play reporter. Sit down, that's an order. You're endangering everyone on board. Ethan didn't flinch. His voice remained even. The world has a right to know what happened here, and what's been happening on your aircrafts long before tonight. His gaze flicked toward the overhead bin still stained with streaks of blood, then back to Rowan. This didn't start with Darius. It started with the silence you all helped protect for a moment. Time stretched. The hum of the engines, the flicker of seatbelt signs, the shuffling of uneasy passengers, everything felt suspended in a single, fragile breath. Darius stepped forward, his movements measured, but his presence filled the aisle like a storm cloud. He studied Ethan, weighing his words, trying to read between the lines. You said you've been tracking the airline? His voice was low, gravelly, hollowed out by pain. Ethan nodded, lowering his phone slowly. Anonymous tips, employee testimonies, internal safety violations swept under the rug. Conrad Vale's name has come up more than once. Tonight, I didn't just board as a passenger, I boarded as a witness. The cabin erupted in murmurs again. Some passengers turned to each other, whispering furiously. Others stared blankly ahead, stunned by the reality that this nightmare had roots deeper than they imagined. Darius's jaw tightened. The fury in him, raw and burning, flickered with new direction. He wasn't just a grieving father, he was a man with leverage. Behind them, Desmond Crowe, the co-pilot, discreetly shifted position near the cockpit door, pressing a sequence into a control panel by the wall. A red light blinked faintly above, a silent signal. He stepped away and moved toward Rowan, whispering low. I've requested emergency diversion. Ground security's prepping a full containment team at Hardlin Airstrip. They'll be ready when we land. Rowan's eyes darted to the blinking light, then to Darius. Good, he muttered, barely audible. We'll finish this on the ground. But Darius noticed the exchange. He saw Desmond's subtle nod, the tension in Rowan's shoulders, the way their voices dropped. His instincts, sharpened by years of boardroom politics and silent betrayals, sensed a new danger. These men were not planning a fair hearing. They were preparing a trap. He turned back to Ethan. What happens to your footage if they take your phone? Smash it? Bury the story like they buried my son? Ethan's face remained composed. Everything's backed up. Cloud encrypted. If I go silent, it releases automatically. But I'd rather be alive to tell the story. Darius nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then keep filming. Rowan stepped forward again. Enough. Everyone sit down. We are in a controlled emergency situation. Any further defiance will be met with force. The captain's voice tried to dominate, but his authority was unraveling. The passengers weren't looking at him anymore. They were watching Darius and Ethan, the businessman with blood on his hands and the journalist with truth on his lens. A man in row 14 stood halfway. Captain, with respect, we saw what happened. That baby didn't stand a chance. And that man, he gestured to Darius, he did what any father might have done. Rowan's voice cracked slightly. Sir, sit down. But more murmurs followed. The passengers, once frozen by fear, now stirred with indignation. Their eyes were waking. Darius felt it, power shifting, pressure building not against him but around him. He could almost taste the tide turning. Still, the danger below loomed larger than the drama in the sky. Darius leaned against a seatback, breathing hard, Malik's blood-soaked blanket clutched in one hand. His voice was quieter now, more haunted than hostile. They'll be waiting for me down there, he said to Ethan, not to ask questions, but to silence everything. Including you. Ethan's face paled. He hadn't considered that. Then we make sure the story's already gone before we land. Desmond's voice came over the intercom suddenly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're diverting to Hardlin Airstrip for immediate medical and security assistance. Please remain seated. Gasps filled the cabin again. A murmur swept through the passengers. Hardlin? That wasn't the destination. That wasn't even a major airport. Why there? Foreshadowing dripped from every word, every mechanical buzz of the intercom. And Darius knew. This wasn't a landing. It was a setup. They didn't want justice. They wanted a cleanup. He looked to the window, to the distant lights below creeping closer through the clouds, then to Ethan, whose fingers now hovered over his phone screen, ready to push a single button that could change everything. Darius exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening with new resolve. Sometimes the runway is not salvation, but the stage for a darker trial. Darius stood firm in the narrow aisle, his knuckles white around the edge of the metal tray, the other hand clutching Malik's blood-stained blanket like a lifeline. The cabin air felt tighter now, as if the pressure inside the aircraft was no longer controlled by altitude, but by tension ready to burst. Every eye watched him, some wide with fear, others glassy with sympathy, but no one dared move. He could feel the vibration of the engines beneath his shoes, a low hum reminding him how far from the ground they were, how little time remained. Darius? Ethan's voice came in a hushed whisper close to his ear. I have files, emails, internal memos, witness reports. This isn't the first time. Conrad Vale's been protected for years. He wasn't the first. Just the most reckless. Darius turned slowly to face him. Ethan's phone screen glowed in his palm, displaying what looked like a secure folder with dozens of documents. His expression was grave but resolute. They buried complaints. Silenced staff. Delayed investigations until victims gave up or disappeared, Ethan added, his voice trembling, not from fear, but urgency. A sharp breath caught in Darius's throat. Malik's death, his son's final breath snuffed out in a space meant for luggage, was no longer just a moment of madness. It was a link in a chain of cruelty, a pattern, a system. Rowan Steele stepped forward again, his boots clicking softly on the aisle floor, his hands raised in a show of calm. But his eyes were hard, calculating. Behind him, Desmond Crowe remained near the cockpit, one hand subtly holding a radio pressed to his mouth. A faint murmur of coded instructions came through its speaker, nearly drowned by the low murmuring of the passengers. Mr. Kellington, Rowan began, his voice attempting warmth but falling just short. I understand your pain. I understand the anger. But this has to stop now. I can offer you safe passage, no cuffs. I'll personally testify if it goes to court, but you need to surrender. For your sake. Darius's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head slightly, studying the captain. Every syllable sounded rehearsed, polished like a line fed by someone waiting behind a curtain. He didn't move. Not yet. You'll testify? Darius repeated, voice quiet but loaded. "You'll stand by my side after this plane lands?" "I will," Rowan nodded quickly. "You have my word." Darius's lips parted, and for a second it seemed he might give in. But then he glanced sideways just for a second and caught Desmond's hand still at the radio, his fingers tapping nervously, transmitting something silently. The small motion sliced through the illusion like a razor. He stepped forward just once, and Rowan instinctively took a step back. "I've been in enough boardrooms to smell a lie," Darius said, low and sharp. "You're not offering safety. You're buying time. Those men waiting at the gate aren't here to listen. They're here to erase." The passengers stirred. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others turned toward Desmond, now realizing the quiet background hum of his communication. Darius raised the metal tray slightly, not to threaten, but to remind them all he wasn't done fighting. Rowan's mouth opened, but Darius cut him off. "You let Conrad work this flight," Darius said, stepping closer. "You let him handle passengers. You let him near my child, and now you ask me to trust you." "I didn't know," Rowan tried. "You chose not to know," Darius answered, eyes burning, "and that makes you no better." Ethan stood frozen, his phone still open. He didn't speak, not yet. The weight of the moment was too heavy for commentary. Even the engines seemed quieter now, the tension inside more deafening than the noise outside. Darius raised the blanket, Malik's blanket, still soaked in dried blood and crumpled where the tiny body had been wrapped in it. It trembled in his hand, not from weakness, but from the fury of a father refusing to be ignored. "I'm not asking for revenge anymore," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to every row. "I'm demanding truth. You all saw what happened. You heard the bones. You watched him smile." The cabin was silent. Even the flight attendants who had earlier tried to subdue him, Marcus bruised, Julian groaning quietly in the galley, stared at him now, not with hostility, but something bordering on understanding. Rowan exhaled slowly, his voice cracking just slightly. "Please, Darius. This has to end." "It will end," Darius replied, "but not the way you think." Then he turned to the passengers again, his voice calm, cold, certain. "There are files. There is proof. This is not about a single scream in the dark. It's about the silence that follows because no one wants to listen." He met Rowan's gaze one last time, and with a bitter smile that held no joy, he spoke the final truth of the moment. Every false promise sounded, like a verdict already written. The descent began with a sudden jolt. The cabin trembled, and a deep mechanical groan echoed through the fuselage as the landing gear dropped into place. Passengers instinctively reached for the armrests, eyes wide, breaths held. The blinking lights along the runway appeared through the small oval windows, tiny dots at first, growing steadily larger. Yet despite the usual signs of an approaching landing, the mood inside was anything but routine. Darius Kellington stood near the center of the aisle, unmoving. His shirt was soaked with sweat, creased with blood from earlier violence. In his hand, he clutched Malik's tiny blanket, now tattered and stained. The red smears across the soft fabric had darkened with time, but for Darius, they were fresh. Too fresh. His fingers gripped it like a lifeline, or perhaps like the final piece of a soul shattered beyond repair. Beside him, Ethan Braddock shifted in the aisle. His phone glowed faintly in his hand, the screen displaying a compressed file folder ready to be released. Videos, reports, voice memos, evidence of corruption, cruelty, and a history of abuse long buried by airline executives. Ethan's jaw was tight, his voice low as he leaned closer to Darius. "I'll send it the moment we hit the tarmac," he whispered. Darius nodded, but didn't speak. His eyes were locked forward, scanning the rows of passengers, the overhead bins, and the cockpit door ahead. He was calculating every possible move, weighing every second left. He knew what was waiting on the ground. Not aid, not inquiry. Force. From the front of the plane, Captain Rowan Steele's voice crackled through the cabin speakers, calm but devoid of warmth. "Flight crew, prepare for containment." The word struck like a thunderclap, far louder than the engine noise or the landing gear rumble. Several passengers looked at one another, confused. Others understood. Marcus, the bruised flight attendant slouched near the galley, groaned quietly. "They should have taken him down earlier." Julian, still clutching his shoulder where Darius had struck him with the tray, muttered under his breath, "He won't go down easy now." "Not after that," Inside the cockpit, Desmond Crowe, the co-pilot, silently keyed in an emergency confirmation code to ground control. Reinforcements were already waiting below. Law enforcement, maybe federal agents. Their mission wasn't to investigate, they were coming to silence, to secure, to contain the chaos before it touched the public eye. Darius could feel it. The final seconds before impact, before metal met pavement, before uniformed strangers stormed the cabin and tried to reduce everything to protocol and restraint. He turned his head slightly, addressing Ethan again without looking directly at him. "If they stop me, send the files. Don't wait." Ethan gave a single nod. "They'll be watching everything. I'll upload it to 5 outlets at once. It won't be hidden anymore." A low murmur swept through the passengers. Tension had turned them from silent observers into hesitant allies. One man near the back whispered, "That attendant killed the baby." Another answered, "But he's going to get blamed." The growing awareness was subtle but undeniable. The line between villain and victim was no longer clear. The truth had taken root. Darius stepped slowly into the aisle's center and lifted Malik's blanket high above his head. "Look at this," he shouted, his voice rough, breaking at the edges. "This is what happens when cruelty is allowed to wear a uniform." He paused, his chest heaving. The silence that followed was unbearable. Every eye turned to him. Even the lights overhead seemed dimmer, the hum of the engines fading beneath the weight of his words. "This is my son's blood," he continued, "and it's not just mine anymore. You all saw it. You all know. What they called order. What they called procedure. It killed an innocent child." Rowan stood outside the cockpit door, unmoving. He said nothing. He couldn't. His crew had failed. His airline had failed. And now, his control over the situation was slipping, one truth at a time. The flight attendants stood back, unsure of what to do. Their hands hovered near the restraints, but no one moved forward. From the back, Ethan raised his phone higher, recording again. This time, not in secret. Not as a journalist gathering intel, but as a man standing with another in a moment that could not be erased. Darius lowered the blanket, folding it slowly, reverently, like a flag at a funeral. "They think this ends when we land," he said quietly, but the whole cabin heard him. "But it's only just begun." The rumble grew louder. The lights of the runway now filled the windows. Flaps adjusted. A mechanical whine stretched through the fuselage. The wheels braced for impact. And in the final moments before touchdown, the audience saw what the passengers were only beginning to realize. The descent carried not just a plane, but the weight of justice unfinished. The wheels screeched against the runway, sending a sharp jolt through the cabin. Oxygen masks trembled in their compartments, overhead bins rattled violently, and passengers gripped their armrests as the plane bounced before finally settling into a steady roll. The landing gear screamed beneath them, friction grinding against the tarmac like a warning from the earth itself. Inside the aircraft, tension clung to every surface. It wasn't over, not even close. Ethan Braddock didn't wait. As the plane decelerated toward the gate, he thumbed the glowing screen of his phone and tapped send. The files, the footage, the damning documents, all of it, burst into the world like shrapnel from a long-buried truth. The signal caught instantly. Within seconds, notifications began lighting up phones across the cabin. Passengers looked down in disbelief. A headline flashed, "Whistleblower exposes airline abuse after mid-air tragedy." Another followed. "Live. Shocking video from Flight 308 leaks to press. Viewer discretion advised." Gasps echoed. Whispers turned into murmurs. Tension that had been bottled for hours now surged through the cabin like a wave no marshal could stop. The jet bridge hissed as it locked into place. The first boot slammed onto the aircraft floor with mechanical precision. Armed marshals, clad in black and gray, stormed in formation. Their voices barked orders, clear, sharp, unyielding. "Everyone remain in your seats, hands visible, nobody moves." Passengers froze, some out of fear, others out of disbelief. The uniforms looked prepared for battle, their presence erasing any illusion of a peaceful resolution. But just as the marshals began to move toward the front of the plane, a single voice broke through the mounting pressure. "He didn't start this," yelled a man from row 6, his voice trembling but fierce. Another passenger stood. "We saw what that attendant did to the baby. We'll testify." The aisle erupted with shouting. A father in a business suit raised his phone. "It's all recorded. I've got it right here." The marshals hesitated, clearly unprepared for the wave of resistance from ordinary civilians. The men in suits, trained to contain a single threat, now faced dozens of voices rising in protest, not to cause chaos, but to demand justice. At the center of it all, Darius Kellington sat slumped against a row of seats, his arms wrapped tightly around Malik's blood-stained blanket. His shirt was torn, soaked in sweat, smeared with the dried aftermath of the battle that had taken place thousands of feet in the air. His hands shook, but his eyes burned with clarity. He didn't resist as the marshals approached. He stood on his own, every movement deliberate. They surrounded him with caution, but Darius didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just held the blanket closer, as if it were still warm with Malik's heartbeat. The cabin seemed to dim around him, as if the gravity of what had been lost absorbed the light. "Hands behind your back," one marshal ordered. Darius complied. A marshal clicked the restraints into place, tight, cold, metallic. The sound rang out louder than the engines. As they began to lead him down the narrow aisle, passengers parted like a tide. Some stared in awe. Others bowed their heads. A few reached out, small gestures, a hand on his arm, a whisper of, "We're with you," their voices trembling with emotion. No one looked away. Ethan stood to the side, still recording, still transmitting. He nodded once, silently, and Darius returned it. Nothing needed to be said. Outside the aircraft, at the edge of the jet bridge, reporters had already gathered. Cameras waited. Satellite trucks blinked red. The airline's legal team watched from a distance, pale-faced and expressionless. They knew now that control was lost. That story, once theirs to spin, now belonged to the world. Darius stepped out of the plane with iron in his spine. His arms were bound, but he walked with the weight of a man carrying more than chains. He walked with purpose, with memory, with proof. And behind him, still stained with blood, the overhead bin remained sealed, silent, cold, and damning. Inside the cabin, a whisper passed among the passengers like a prayer. What began as one man's vengeance had become a nation's reckoning. The courtroom was silent as the footage played on the projection screen, each frame flickering like a haunting memory no one could escape. Gasps echoed through the gallery as the image froze. Malik's blood-stained blanket in Darius's trembling hands, the overhead bin ajar behind him, streaked in red. The prosecution had tried to skip the video, arguing it was too graphic. The judge, a grizzled man named Harland Greaves with a reputation for restraint, allowed it. "The truth," he had stated bluntly, "is sometimes hard to watch." Darius sat at the defense table, expression still and composed, but his fingers gripped the edge of the chair so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Across from him, the prosecutor, Martin Leach, stood tall and smooth-voiced, trying to recast the narrative for the jury. "What you just saw is not justice," he said, turning slowly to face them. "It is vengeance. Brutal, unlawful, deadly vengeance. And while we understand grief, we do not excuse murder." Ethan Braddock, the journalist who had recorded the events on the flight, was the next to take the stand. As he walked toward the witness box, whispers rippled through the audience. He straightened his tie, nodded respectfully to the judge, then turned to face the room. The defense attorney, Gregory Shaw, approached first. "Mr. Braddock," Shaw began, "can you tell the court why you were on that flight?" Ethan's voice was steady, clear. "I received multiple anonymous tips from airline employees," he said, "tips that indicated a culture of abuse and cover-up within Monarch Skylines. One name kept appearing in those messages, Conrad Vale. And did you see anything on that flight that confirmed those tips?" Shaw pressed. Ethan's eyes darkened slightly. "Yes, I saw a man lose his child to violence, and no one stepped in until it was too late." Gasps again. The jury members shifted uncomfortably. Prosecutor Leach objected, claiming the statement was inflammatory. The judge overruled him. Over the next hour, Ethan unfolded a digital trail of damning documents, emails, memos, internal warnings, all ignored. There were formal complaints against Conrad, spanning 8 years, detailing mistreatment of elderly passengers, racial targeting, and even one previous incident involving a toddler forcibly removed from a mother's lap. None had resulted in termination. None had reached the FAA. Monarch Skylines had buried them all. Darius sat unmoving as the documents were displayed, but each revelation chipped away at the wall he'd built inside. His lawyer turned to him briefly. "They're seeing it now," Shaw whispered. Later, one by one, passengers from the flight were called. A businessman named Rajan Patel described Conrad's tone, his words, the cruelty that dripped from every interaction with Darius. An elderly man, Clark Denton, said he had seen the attendant mutter racial slurs. A teenage boy, Jeremy Fields, broke into tears as he recalled hearing the sound. "A sickening snap," he said, and no one could believe it was real. The most pivotal moment came when the captain, Rowan Steele, took the stand. Clean-shaven, uniformed, eyes rimmed with fatigue, he tried to maintain authority. But the defense team was ready. "Captain Steele," Shaw said, "did you or did you not request ground authorities to prepare lethal intervention upon landing?" Rowan hesitated. "Yes," he said at last. "Did you tell Darius Kellington he would be safe if he surrendered?" Another pause. "Yes." "Did you mean it?" Rowan looked away. "No." The courtroom felt as if it exhaled all at once. The mask had slipped. Authority had lied. The jury, once uncertain, now leaned forward with intent in their eyes. The weight of the truth bore down on everyone present. And then came the verdict. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The judge's gavel tapped twice, and silence fell once more. The foreman, a tall man with a trembling sheet of paper in his hand, read aloud, "In the matter of Darius Kellington, charged with second-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant guilty of manslaughter." The air left the room. Not murder, manslaughter, but the verdict was only the first tremor. The judge's sentencing declaration was unorthodox. This case has revealed not only the tragic loss of a child, but the loss of public trust. The conduct of Monarch Skylines cannot go unpunished. He ordered sweeping reforms across the airline, new training protocols, mandatory mental health screenings for crew, third-party investigations into all prior complaints. Civil suits would follow, and already news anchors called it the reckoning at 30,000 feet. Executives of the airline were indicted days later on charges of negligence and obstruction of justice. The company's stock collapsed. Shareholders revolted. Change began, not because of policy, but because of a father's raw defiance in the face of silence. Darius was led out of the courtroom in cuffs, but his chin was high, eyes steady. Reporters swarmed the steps. Some yelled questions, others simply watched. Inside, Ethan looked down at his notes, then slowly closed the folder. Darius's name was no longer just a headline. It was a symbol. And as the judge's voice echoed in memory, the courtroom emptying around him, Ethan scribbled the final line of his article. "Sometimes vengeance is not the end of justice, but the beginning of it." Seconds later, the father struck back. The same bin became the flight attendant's downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and violent retaliation against unchecked authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and reform.